All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yulia Ivanuk, and I'm the coordinator of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that are made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you to the CUC's lecture series. The theme of our webinar today is My Ukraine is Here, the politics of cultural and intellectual production of the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada between 1945 and 1991. Please note that our discussion is being video recorded and it will be posted on our social media later on. So feel free to submit your questions into the chat box at any point, and we'll make sure to at least attempt to address as many of them as possible during the Q&A session. So I have had the pleasure of meeting Elisa Lucente this summer in Winnipeg, as Elisa was conducting her field work in various provinces in Canada, interviewing Ukrainian Canadian community members. And ever since then, I have been really looking forward to having Elisa present her findings for us here at the center. Elisa Lucente graduated in International Cooperation on Human Rights and Intercultural Heritage from the University of Bologna, and is currently a PhD candidate in history at the University of Pavia, under the supervision of Professor Zilioli. Her PhD thesis explores the processes of identity construction in the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada during the Cold War. And also her wider research interests deal with the urban history and memory studies. Elisa, the digital floor is all yours.
Yay. So I'll try to share my screen. So yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I feel, as I said before, I feel the pressure of it because I'm still writing my thesis. I'm writing the second chapter right now, but I'll try to give a sort of introduction of the process of the topic I chose, why I chose it, and how I structure my work, and the first findings I had. And I already know that I think more questions than answers. So I hope you're not expecting too many answers from me. But I will start with the first question that everyone asked me when I was in Canada. That was why do you choose to study the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada? Since I am Italian, I don't have any connection nor with Canada or with Ukraine. I met Ukraine as a field of study during my master's degree. And I think also I met Canada during the same year. It was 2019. I was in Canada, and then I was in Ukraine for my thesis, which was about memory politics in Lviv. And I think that these two countries kept crossing one another in my path. It was kind of, I saw Ukraine coming out when I was in Canada, and Canada when I was in Ukraine. So the PhD, it's in history, but the first specification I want to do is what is history? What does history mean to me? Because from one perspective, there is, of course, the idea of finding truth, I think, what the events were, what really happened. But then there is also another perspective, which is more close to me and to my interest and my research, which is actually finding the different perspectives and point of view of the same event. So yes, the first thing I did when I chose the topic was, of course, reading all the literature and all the waves and try to understand a little bit. And I was really interested in all the production and all the books and all the literature that there were mentioning what was called the DP generation and how it was a political immigration and everything happening after the Second World War. So I think I chose this wave because it was sort of laboratory for me for studying a nation building process, and from afar. It's sort of you are displaced by the war and everything that happened in there. In the literature, there was this idea of institutionalization in the DP camps in Europe and in Germany, in Austria, and in Italy. And there, I think that was really the point that I said, okay, I want to focus on this third wave and see how nation building processes and how they can interact with migration. And very academically, I had to choose the methods and theories and how to work with this topic. And of course, it's an history project, so I had to dig into archives. But since my first idea was the sort of listening the different point of views and understanding from the in-between, like the processes that were there, I chose and I'll try to having this, deciding to interviewing people and doing, trying to do oral history also of this object. After the first year, so I had decided to how to structure my work. The main thesis was that the third wave was considered a diaspora, and what does it mean? I think, in my opinion, given the literature and migration studies, a diaspora is a specific migration that has a strong collective memory, of the past, and that in the process of displacement, elaborate a mission, which is typical of every diasporic group like the Jewish one, for example. And another central topic was the one that was also, I think, the most problematic for me, the question of return. So when you are a diaspora and you are hoping that you will be back home at one point when your mission is finally solved. So I thought that it was very logic to structure my thesis in 3 different parts. There will be like 6 chapters, so 2 for each one. The first one, which is displacement, takes place in between the end of the Second World War, and I think that the first turning point was the 60s. So it's mainly the first turning point that I found in this. And the second one, translation, I think it's more it will be the point of the cultural and intellectual production that happened in between the process of displacement and when you are in Canada. So there are like 2 very different projects and 2 very different, I think, ideas behind the displacement in the camps and then the work as a community in a different state like Canada. And the last one is linked to the idea that I said before, the one of return and non-return. So how in the end, after independence, the independence itself of Ukraine, that at that point could mean a sort of, okay, our mission can be considered done, how impacted on the community and on that specific wave with its own dynamics. To talk a little bit more about what what was my main findings, let's say. The camp experience. As concerned the camp experience, there is this very interesting definition gave by the historian Antons. These camps were a nation in a nutshell. And at the same, that it's actually a dynamic that it's not only Ukrainian, there are other researches on, for example, Poland or the Baltic states, and how nationalism grew in the camps between among those communities. And the literature addressed the topic of the camp in different ways. There is the institutional part of the international community, so what relief agencies did there, and how they define displaced person or refugees, which were the differences between the two concepts. The fact that it was actually the military agencies that first decided to divide communities along the line of nationality. That was one of the most difficult part to address, because nationality meant different things. It was not, it cannot be considered as a citizenship, as for the Western Allied was. And so defining someone as Ukrainian, it was kind of very challenging for who didn't know what. I found very interesting when I read in his newspapers of the time of the community, of the Ukrainian community there, like we had to struggle to let people understand who we are, what we want, who we are, why we don't want to go back to the Soviet Union or to Poland or whatever their former city was after the Second World War. And then there is all another set of literature written mainly by people who were in the camp, who experienced that, so memoirs, or that are focusing more on the camp experience. Those ones were very interesting to me to understand the processes that were going on there. But at the same time, it made me wonder if they were not somehow talking about the topic in isolation from the historical context where they were when it happened. Because it's kind of the historicizing it. It's called, there is this camp that it seems out of nowhere, and and there are dynamics in there, but they were very in a specific context. They were in Germany, they were in Austria, they were under different occupation zone. They were British or American, or all another story are the camps that were in Italy, for example. So the main point is that was the first time that I think all people coming as together, defining themselves as a Ukrainian community in a national sense, elaborating also, as I said, the national mission that was the core of the diasporic identity. A national mission that was, of course, to liberate Ukraine. And reading those sources now, for me, it's sort of challenging to keep the things separated, because it's I read many sentences that are recurring, and I can read them, and that can be exactly the same of any other newspaper right now. So that's interesting also to know how the vocabulary is the same, for example. But talking to testimonies and reading memoirs, I also had to, I came across different categories, the vulnerable, the invisible in the history, of course. For example, women or children in DP camps. And those case studies helped me a lot understanding dynamics that were more of an everyday life. So in a very putting again things in the context. So there were celebrations, there were going to school, there were going to church, very like everyday actions, like it was back again in the context, or trips to the Alps. And for the first time, I said, okay, the camps were somewhere physically, like in a sense. And from that point, from this core, this first institutionalization in a sense of association, which is another interesting thing, is that the nation building process here happening with institution. There were institutions, but they were not state institutions. There were association, there were other associations that were not from Ukraine, so like the Ukrainian Canadian Association of the first and the second wave, so who were already in Canada, in the United States, in Great Britain, all over. From this point, I was very interested in the process of sort of shifting this idea of shifting Ukraine, of moving Ukraine, and this is actually coming from an interview I had. It's the Homeland in a Suitcase. This idea of having everything in a suitcase, but the everything was also the national idea, the Ukrainian idea, their homeland, the motherland, and also the idea of it was very recurrent in interviews. Also, for example, that. A woman told me it's kind of like my parents were sit on the suitcase for like over for their whole life, sort of waiting for coming back. And then when finally like the resettlement in different countries like and Canada happened, I found very interestingly how difficult it was the encounter with the Ukrainian community in Canada from both sides. I mean, it's very complex because of all the different waves and generation and ideological point of view of the Ukrainian Canadian community before the war, but. What I think that what was interesting was the sort of how the third wave was considered at first something like different, both within and outside. So it was, again, I read several times in a newspaper this idea of this DP generation being nationalist, or all the vocabulary that was used at the time. And I think that as I said before, the 60s turned out to be a very important point for the community, for different, I think, that there were different causes. There was the new generation that grew up, which seems very stupid, but actually it's when there is a new generation, there are new dynamics, especially the young generation there was grew up in Canada and studied in Canada, and I tried to collect as many sources on celebrations, commemoration, even the construction of monuments in Canada, because it was interesting to study how people and communities and the association and organizations interact also with the Canadian landscape. I think that it's also a sort of legitimation and recognition of its own community. And at this point, of the research. So when I was getting into the 60s and the 70s, I think I realized how my thesis was more about Canada than was about Ukraine. I started it interested in the Ukrainian national idea from afar, and then I was back into yes, but it's sort of Ukraine is a performance, the idea, and then there is a stage, there is Canada, there is the place where you live every day, and you have to find a way to belong to both. So there is your own belonging of the motherland and the homeland, and the practical belonging of your everyday life. There was the study of all this what I call this memoryscapes or monuments that were like I was actually interested in how many there were. I didn't expect them, but then I found out that it was a very common thing because there were also 2 or 3 monuments also in Italy, Ukrainian monuments in Italy that I knew nothing about. So it's interesting also how communities wants to, earn and gain recognition on the space. And networks of belonging, it's another topic that came out and was very interested, is that when you think of this diaspora in Canada and the Cold War and the Soviet Union, usually there is this idea of, okay, there was this pro-Soviet and anti-Soviet Ukrainian community, and then there was Soviet Ukraine. I think that things were more and more different and complex in their levels of interaction, because there were contacts also with families, even if they were controlled by the authorities. There were also points in which they can also go there, like, for example, the Koshet choir that went in Soviet Ukraine for a tour there. So it's not really, there was not a real wall. There were interactions, even if they were maybe not central, but and in the 70s and the 80s, I think that one of the most central points where the institutionalization also of Ukrainian studies as a field of study, there was another point that at the beginning I wasn't aware. So I came also to think how it also became important, like the academia became important as a nation building tool, which is something actually that I'm still thinking about it, because it will be very, very, like for us, if I'm thinking about Italian studies in North America are not really, they were not a nation building tool, but at the same time, there were no mission at the time for the Italian community. So the use of academia also for having a political impact on the society was very interesting, with everything that was connected by it. And now I don't have really the time to get into all the different projects that happened, but for one for all was for sure the encyclopedia, which was a very I think enlightenment idea of building also an encyclopedia of the nation that I really found interesting. This is a quote that made me laugh a lot, actually. Was where does one go to learn German? Berlin, and so on, and where does one go to learn Ukrainian? Canada. And even if I really laugh about it at first, I also thought really how strong and powerful the idea of the national idea and the preservation of Ukrainian identity was at the time, even if as I said before, it became more a thesis on Canada because it's the construction of Ukraine in Canada, I think, says more about Canada than it can about Ukraine, I think. But it's just my impression as I'm going through the study. As concerned the last point, which is one, I think that it's the part I was more interested in, it's more fascinating to me. It's this idea of return and non-return and what went back to Ukraine after independence and what did not. So first, there is this narratives of non-return in the idea that Ukrainian Canadians at this point had not only to face Ukrainian independence, but to face themselves in the sense of their own life built in another place. And I found also very, it's a coincidence, but at the same time very symbolic that the centennial of the Ukrainian migration to Canada was 1991. So there were many celebration of the Ukrainian Canadian community from one side and with the Ukrainian independence on the other. So I guess there is also the part of where we are, like we are in the Ukraine and as Ukrainian or as Ukrainian Canadians. And in the interviews, another point that came out, I think, in almost all of them was that all the trips that were done after independence to Ukraine. So what happened there? What does it mean to go back home? What were the feeling of going back to Ukraine for the first time, or for defense if they had the chance to go there also other times before that? And one of the most striking quotation I found in the interviews was that Ukraine was not the land of Shevchenko anymore, which was interesting to me. And it's, I think, the point in which I chose the title of my research, which is My Ukraine is Here, in this sense, that something happened there, and what we preserve here, it's the national culture, yes, of course, but we cannot underestimate the fact that the history in the actual territory of Ukraine is that there was the Soviet Union. It's kind of, we cannot say that it's, I don't think we can reduce everything in. There was an occupation that lasted for 70 years, and then there is independence and we're free. I think there are more shades in the interpretation of this. At least it was my impression when I was in Ukraine. And this My Ukraine is Here actually came, of course, from another interview, but it was a very interesting story. Because a woman was asking me was telling me about the time she went back to Ukraine with her father, and he was happy to go back home in the sense of going back to Ukraine. And when he was on the plane back to Canada, and he was sit next to her, he told her, now we are going home. It was sort of, I think, this idea that, okay, there is the ideal home in the idea of national idea, and there is then your belonging of your life and your family is there, and you grew up there, and maybe your children also grew up there. But of course, there is this big limitation that I talked only to people that did not go back to Ukraine. So I don't know if there is this, and how is the feeling of who actually decided to go back, of that that wave and in the community. But even if I didn't have the chance yet, at least to talk to them, to to people who decided to go back, I asked myself if something was actually, if something went back. And I think that it was all the intellectual and cultural production that was done in the universities, but not only in the universities, of course, and this idea of preserving the Ukrainian traditions. It went back, even if it had, I think, also, it's another thing that should not be oversimplified, because there was also, it was difficult also to accept it, I think, in Ukraine as a state, as independent and national state. But I think that what was very important, it was the role that the Ukrainian Canadian community as a whole, now I'm not really talking only about the third wave, but had after independence on Ukraine, which is not it's not my topic. I will stop at the independence with my sources. But I think that it is not really studied how much this cultural and intellectual production actually was then introduced back in Ukraine. I have now, after the Russian invasion, I had 2-3 Ukrainian girls that I met here in Italy. I was talking to them about my research, and they were like looking at me and say, "Oh, that's why my textbook, my history textbook, was printed and published by a Canadian publisher." And they were like asking me, like, now we know why it was that important, or where it came from. And I think that, of course, we are experiencing another turning point in history, so it's difficult now. When I said path of future research, wasn't there, so my idea was completely different, because at first I sort of found that the division was going away somehow. We're going through this elaboration, and as we can talk also about the Soviet past there. And now after what happened, I think that there will be more exacerbation, of course, of the vocabulary, and also about what people will study and with what aim they are studying it. But I think that it's also, it will be impossible not to. I mean, we cannot forget where we are and what's happening. So yes, I think that the main points that I will try to address are this one, are the point of belonging and how you change your own identity, the role that intellectual history has on nation building, when it's more explicit, as in the case of the field of Ukrainian studies. With also in Italy, we have Ukrainian studies, which is not that immediate to think about. It's kind of, I don't think that everyone would expect Italy having a field of Ukrainian studies. And the last point, I think it's the most difficult to deal with, because it's about Canadian identity. Because we cannot, I think, address Ukrainian Canadian identity without also asking ourselves this national idea and the nation that means everything different. I think in every language it has a different shade of meaning. How can we put it in on a Canadian context? This idea of multiculturalism or mosaics of ethnic communities, what role Canada had in all of this, because I mean, my point of view, of course, it's more inside the community, but we cannot underestimate the point that Canada had an impact in financing, first of all, and also to accepting the idea that Canada is made of ethnic communities, which is not something that we can think in other countries. Like in European countries, for example, it will be very, very difficult, if not, I say, impossible. Like I'm talking about Italy, for example, to accept the fact that Italy is made of different ethnic communities that are not Italians, like Italy made of French community or German community. It's something not that I think easy to understand and to grasp. But that's why I think Canadian context is that interesting, especially right now, especially for scholars of European studies, that now European countries are becoming countries of immigration and not emigration anymore. So studying and understanding these dynamics, I think it will be very, very interesting. So I think I can stop here. So.
Thank you so much, Elisa. It was so informative, and I think that there are going to be a lot of questions for us to explore here. So feel free to submit your questions into the chat box if you'd like. In the meantime, we already have one question from the audience. So Elisa, you've made a reference to transnational reciprocity between Ukraine and Canada. So perhaps you could elaborate on the idea of performativity and continuation of tradition in the foreign land. Is national identity more personified on the individual level, or is it exercised through mutual collaboration as a collective project, or perhaps both? So if you have any ideas on this, that would be great to have your input.
I think, yeah. I think that it is kind of both. I mean, it's it's a very interesting question. Thank you, because there are these two levels that actually I found when I was interviewing people. When you interview someone, you are talking with that person, and each person has its own background and their own idea, their own experience also, I think. And so what the national identity and what does it mean to be Ukrainian or Ukrainian Canadian or Ukrainian in Canada meant for everyone? It's different. But of course, I think that the difference between, for example, the Ukrainian community in Canada or any other minority, for example, in Italy, or maybe in Canada too, like the Italian community in Canada too. It's the idea, it's the fact that you have an institutionalized network of association, of organization, of events, of celebrations that can help you sort of insert your identity and your belonging and your experiences in something common, in something that it's not only yours, but it's a common thing. And at that point, that your own belonging becomes, I think, a national narrative. And a national narrative, I would say. Also, the idea of the camp that I said before. The DP camps in the official documents are called assembly centers. The fact that everyone called this refugee camp and DP camp, of course, it's also the fact that nowadays the vocabulary changed, but it's also something that it's passed and this was transmitted from generation to generation. We were the DP generation, we were the DPs in this negative sense, which so yes, I think that there is always intersection between I think individual and communal level. Yes.
Thank you for your astute answer. Lisa, we know that compared to the first two waves of Ukrainian migration to Canada, which occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the third wave was larger in scale and more diverse in terms of the geographic origin of the migrants. and also the destination countries that they went to. I was wondering if you could unpack some of the main differences that made the third wave of Ukrainian migration to Canada unique, and how it informed their relationship with both the representatives of the already existing waves of Ukrainian Canadians and also the broader multicultural surrounding.
Yeah. Well, of course, there are objective facts, the fact that they were not only from Western Ukraine, that also Eastern Ukrainian memories came into Canada, also their professional background, the fact that many were like, there was not only, as I can say, like there were more intellectuals and but in my opinion, even if this itself is a cause, it's like why this wave was different from the other. I think that the main difference is that they had a common experience in the camp. So I think that the camp, the refugee camps are actually this transition place from where you are displaced, you are living your home, but you are not still in the new country, but you are in this space you can where you can build a common experience, because I think that that's made the third wave unique. It's this idea of having this common memory, having this common experience. And so this nation building process was very different from the others, because it was not only linked to the motherland, but it was also linked to how they build this Ukraine in exile, or this nation in a nutshell, and all this definition that were put on labeled on this community. And actually another thing that I think that coming back to the camp, this idea of the camp, the DP camp was not the only camp at the time. So we have concentration camps, we have the Gulag, we have the internment camps in Canada. So I think that the two world wars, but especially the Second World War, the idea, this space of the camp was very fundamental in identity construction, in identity building. It's an idea that I'm still actually have to think about it. So I'm also interested in having feedback from it, because I don't know if I get it correctly. But in my opinion, and from the sources, this common experience in the camp was fundamental in the identity construction afterwards. Yeah.
It's a really interesting point to think about. So thank you for outlining that. Elisa, we know that you have traveled all around Canada and interviewed Ukrainian Canadians in various parts of Canada. Have you encountered any generational or regional differences and perhaps similarities in view of identity among Ukrainian Canadians of the third wave and also among their descendants as well?
Of course I did. And that's, I think, one of the main limitation, one of the limits of the research is the idea that I'm talking about Ukrainian Canadians or the Ukrainian diaspora or the third wave, but it means everything and nothing in my opinion, because what happened at a local level, it's fundamental. For example, in Winnipeg, I had the chance to talk actually with a few people from the third wave. I had more encounter people and talk to people for the first two waves. And in the context of identity, there is also a regional part of Canada. So it's not only regional from Ukraine, but it's a regional Canadian point. So being from Manitoba or the Prairie, it's completely different from the Ontario or Toronto. There are also, it's also challenging to grasp and to find commonalities between them. But this idea, and for my research, in the idea of identity building, I don't think that the processes and dynamics were that different. I think that what it's different, it's how each one interpret the idea of being Ukrainian Canadian. But the relationship with Ukraine and with Canada was not that different of between among different generation and different ways. What it was more interested to me was to meet all the people who get back to Ukraine from the second or third generation of each way, but it depends, of course, of the. I'm not generalizing it, but when I think of people who are born and raised in Canada that go back to not back, but go to Ukraine, it's not back, it's back in the narration, but they are not going really back. That was interesting because I think that it shows how powerful it's this. The national idea and the feeling of belonging of something that you never actually experienced or met, and it just came from your family, from your community. So, yeah.
Thank you. As the follow-up, I was also personally wondering if the question of the preservation of the Ukrainian language came up in your research and your interviews, if you could perhaps unpack the relationship between the linguistic identification and the level or scope of involvement in the community. I think that would be really interesting to hear that.
Yeah, I can start with a when I was in Ukraine and when I was in Kiev, I actually thought that to study Ukraine, I had to know Russian, which was kind of, it seemed evident for me, self-evident. It was, I cannot like doing that. And after 2 weeks in Canada studying sources, I was like, okay, no, it's a kind of, I really have to start studying Ukrainian, and I did. So there was a sort of total external, of course, perspective that I had. So the preservation of language was one of the main things of the national mission that I found out, that it came out like for in every single wave in every generation from any perspective, and also ideological point of view. So even when I met and interviewed people that were considered part of the Ukrainian left, that during the Cold War was considered the pro-Soviet, they were speaking Ukrainian, they were writing Ukrainian, and they also wanted to preserve Ukrainian, even when they went in to Soviet Ukraine at the time. They were talking about the question of language, of the Ukrainian language. So the thing that came out after independence, I think it's the big misunderstanding between the diaspora and Ukrainians there. It's yeah, I'll try. The nation needs only one language, or if the national question is strictly related to the language, to the linguistic point of view. It's something that I'm still trying to think about, because the preservation of Ukrainian language from the diaspora, I think it was one of the most relevant and fundamental things of this big cultural or intellectual production. But at the same time, I met also many Ukrainians that came to Canada after 1991, that were, they said that they, when every time they speak Russian, they were considered not Ukrainians. And so it's challenging, I think, yeah.
Thank you. This wasn't among your direct research questions, but I'm sure that the full-scale invasion must have come up in some shape or form. So how did the perception of the Ukrainian Canadian identity and that commitment to Ukraine and the preservation of its, or perhaps even the rebuilding of the independence, evolve or transform between the World War II, 1990s, and perhaps also the full-scale invasion, or also the Russian invasion of 2014 up to 2022 and the events that followed?
Yeah, well, it was, it's actually, it's not part of my thesis, but it's changed my research completely in the sense that all the interviews that I made before the Russian invasion, I think I perceived a sort of stability also in the identity. I mean, okay, we are Ukrainian Canadians, we are Canadians, we are living in Canada, so we're trying to, of course, we are interested in what happened in Ukraine because it's because this is where we are from and where our roots are. But after February, like the last February, it became again, I think, the mission became alive again. And all the interviews where the vocabulary changed a lot. So the vocabulary also against Russia, because in all the interviews I made before, the Soviet Union and Russia point never was very fundamental, actually. It is in the sources. So if I'm reading newspapers of the 45 or the 50s or the 60s, it was fundamental and central. So it is coming, of course, it is coming up in my thesis, but not in the interviews. And after the war, all the interviews were again using the same vocabulary or of the mission, because it was something coming up again, I think, in his narrative and in that narration. And it was also very, I think, difficult on a personal level, because when you are a researcher, especially of history, you think that you are just dealing with something that already happened, and okay, you are in a sort of safe place. And for me, that was not the case at all, because it's difficult also on a personal level now to talk to someone that it's so involved personally in something. And it's kind of, there are priorities also, I think, in life, and it's a history project that comes after that. So in a sort of empathic way, it was difficult. But yeah, I think that's the main difference. It was in vocabulary of interviews that impacted most in the research.
Thank you. I'm sure it's one of the most difficult things that is happening to everyone in the Ukrainian Canadian community and beyond. Well, the last question for this webinar is, are there any notions that resulted from your research that conflicted with the commonly known perceptions, or perhaps anything that surprised you, anything that you're not expecting to see that came out of your interviews and your broader research as well?
Lots of them. Some of them I talk about that. Yeah, it was every like I think 2 days I was finding something that I wasn't expecting. The main one that I never mentioned before, I think, it's how the Ukrainian Canadian impacted on domestic politics in Canada, most of all in the multiculturalism, because like I'm talking as an external, both from Canadian and Ukrainian environment. And in Italy, we know that Canada is multicultural, but we don't know actually the story that is behind multiculturalism. And when I chose the Ukrainian Canadian community, I didn't know really, like, honestly, I didn't know how relevant and important the community was. And so that's, I think, the most striking thing for me and the most unexpected thing. For the rest, I have to say, many of the interviews were, I think, following what I found in the other sources. So it was not that unexpected in the process, in how the process unfolded. But then there is, I think, all the personal lives that gives you, like, the idea that it's not possible to generalize anything. So it's, yeah, you are talking about something, and you are, of course, trying to write like the story of a community, but at the same time, you cannot really have all the point of view of everyone, which is experiencing differently what they're going through. So of course, talking to each and every one person was a different thing for me and for my research. And another thing, well, I already mentioned that, but the idea of the academia used politically, something that I'm still thinking how, like, if it's still the case or if it's not, and how the other field of study in Canada are interacted with Ukrainian studies. Because I am quite sure that every department of global history, like, just to say one, would not really accept the idea of a nation, like a chair, national chair of something, like just to mention one. But at the same time, was fundamental during the Cold War for so many different perspectives. And another point that I think it will be interested for, it's how the Ukrainian Canadian community entered the Canadian academia from other field of study, because sometimes it's kind of thinking of Canadian Ukrainians, you're just thinking of the Ukrainian studies or Ukrainian Canadian studies. But actually, I think it will be very interesting also to understand how other intellectually, like the intellectual contribution also in other fields. Like, for example, especially in when I was in Winnipeg, this the labor history field was very interesting, how the Ukrainian Canadian community was fundamental also for that in Canada, but it's not as studied as this everything, that it's more in the sense of a nation building and in a single intellectual national fields. So.
Well, thank you so much, Elisa, for this great presentation and for your analysis. And thank you to all of you for joining us here today. You'll have an opportunity to also view the session online, and we'll make sure to send the link to the recording to those who have attended the session today. And please do stay tuned for more events in the future. Thank you, everyone, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.